Hello and welcome back to Web 110, HTML and CSS. So in the next couple of videos, the content is going to correlate with Chapter 7. And Chapter 7 is looking at kind of layout basics. So in the previous videos, we were looking at working with white space and how you can kind of start controlling things a little bit more, but still very much as kind of little isolated pieces on a page. We did look at creating a single column and how you can kind of create a really basic layout, but this chapter is really going to open up how you can really start looking at and organizing things across the whole page and how you kind of work with the layout. Chapter 8 is going to talk about Flexbox and grid layouts, which are newer concepts that have kind of more recently been supported by the W3C and being recommended for being included on websites. It's one of the biggest differences between the older editions of the books is this inclusion of this content. So Chapter 7 is going to show how you can work with items and working with kind of multiple columns in a really basic layout. And then we're going to have more advanced techniques for how to work with that with Chapter 8's content. So just kind of give you an idea, Chapter 7 and Chapter 8 are both going to be focusing a lot on how to work with layouts. And then in Chapter 8, we are also going to be looking at how you can start actually creating sets of styles. So you have sets of styles for desktop, tablet, and mobile. But we're going to start kind of more simply with Chapter 7's content. So I'm going to have us open up Visual Studio Code, and we'll create just a basic file. And this example is one that I'm getting straight from the textbook. So when you go through and you do your reading, it'll probably look familiar. And I'm just going to create a new file, save this, and I created a new folder called Week 5. And I'm just going to call this layout. For the title, I'm going to just say Layout Basics. And then we are going to do our styles as internal. Whoops. All right, so in this example, we are going to be working with divs. Now, there's not necessarily a reason why it has to be a div. It could be something else like a section. And this is where in, what would it have been? Chapter 2, we looked at all of these different HTML elements. And there's this section that says, I believe in the book it says something like more elements or something along those lines of just here are some extra ones. And the textbook listed section. Let me just type this, section. So you might remember that one. They also had side as another one. Now, these are finally going to start coming back now that we're going to start grouping things together. So just as a reminder, you can use divs to group things together, or you can also use sections to group things. And so when you get to working on your homework, you will find that you'll get directions that says put this together into a section. And if you don't remember that section is an actual element, you might be tempted to put it inside of a div. So just kind of a little bit of a heads up on that. But anyways, with this particular example, it's just taking a grouping. And the reason for the div is what this is exploring is how you can group together things, and you can create little containers, you can create columns. Let me actually bring up the homework. All right, so this is a wireframe drawing of what the homework will look like. So you will have a main, and you're going to have 4 sections inside of it, and so it's going to be grouping content into these individual pieces. And that's what's happening here, is we are going to have these H3s, and then there's going to be a paragraph under them. So H3 paragraph, H3 paragraph, H3 paragraph, H3 paragraph. And then we're going to also have the faculty page is going to have a list of a bunch of different names under each, inside of each section as well. So 2 pages are going to have 4 sections on it, and you're going to be dividing up the content. And there's going to be plenty of other things that you can really do with this idea of being able to put things together into little containers. But that's kind of our main thing. It's just looking at how you could take some content in an area like main, and you can kind of divide it up into smaller pieces. So first, inside of body, for this example, we're going to create a div. And actually, I'm going to do this piece by piece. So we're going to have 2 divs, and they're going to need to have something inside of the opening tag. But for now, we're going to put it'll just be some free floating text. This is box 1. And then our second div will say this is box 2. So we can tell them apart. And then in the opening tag for the first div, I'm going to put in class equals, and we'll say div 1. And then in the opening tag for the second one, we'll say class equals div 2. And then we'll be able to style these differently. So for a class, we need to have a period in front of it, and then we'll do div 1. And then we can list all of our styles for div 1. Same thing for div 2. We can list all of our styles. So first thing for our div 1 is we're going to have a width of 200 pixels. So to start off with, the example in the book is going to have a fixed set of styles. So it's going to be 200 pixels wide, 200 pixels tall. We're going to give them a background color so we can tell them apart. And I'm just using the colors that are listed. It might look a little bit different in yours, because I think I took this from the last edition of the book. I think this is one of those examples that stays the same. So we have the background color, we've got a border, that's going to be dashed, we've got a little bit of padding, so there's a little bit of room. And then our second div is going to be smaller, it's going to be 100 pixels. Both width and height. It's going to have white background. It's going to have a slightly different border. This one's going to have a ridge border instead of dashed. It's also going to have 5 pixels of padding. And then this one's going to have a margin of 10 pixels. So I'm going to save that and then go ahead and open this file. All right, so we can kind of see pretty easily, we've got the first box, 200 pixels, a second one, 200 pixels, background color is blue, a light blue, border is dashed, and then there's a little bit of padding, which just makes it so this text isn't right up against this border. If we didn't add that, it would look like that. Now the second box, what's happening with this is it's 100 pixels, width and height, background color is white, border is ridge, and then it also has that 5 pixels of padding. And then we've got 10 pixels of margin. And this is a really good example of how the margins work, because we do get 10 pixels of margin on the side, but because this first one has a default of whatever the browser has, what's happening is this one has, I'm going to guess that's 5 pixels of margin. And then because this one has 10, it's basically allowing it to overlap this space where this is kind of coming in down lower. So if we wanted there to actually be 10 pixels of margin on this bottom one, we would need to actually go ahead and add in, it looks like I had my math a little wrong. So I was thinking that it would need to be 10 pixels, but it looks like it actually needs to be 20 pixels. And my guess here would be we've got the little bit of space here, and then we've got kind of the default space of the body that everything is in as well. But you might find that you have to add in more to just one particular side of whatever is on top, so that way you actually get the spacing that you want, rather than adding that margin to the bottom item. So a lot of times you'll end up having to add margins to the bottom of the thing that's higher up. Anyways, we don't really have to keep this. I just wanted to show you what that would sort of affect. So if you are struggling with anything, a lot of times you have to just mess with the margin top or margin bottom of different items. All right, so the point of this is to look at how by default these are just stacking over top of each other. They have the default display block, so they're going to just be stacked on top of each other. Now we could technically go in and we could say, okay, I want the display to be inline. Let's do that real quick. What I would like to say just is, now if you have something as block, it's going to stack over top of each other. If it's something is inline, it's going to fill in next to each other. But you could encounter an issue where if you have too many things and they don't fill in this space, you end up with a horizontal scroll. And so there are going to be reasons why you might want to have something be flexible, where if there's room, it's going to fill in, but if there's not room, it's going to move on to the next line. So that's part of what we're going to be looking at. All right, let me put this back. Okay, so we've got these two stacked over top of each other because they have the display block by default. We don't even necessarily have to specify that. So what I want to do is I'm going to take, and this is where it can get a little confusing, so I'm going to add a little bit of space. I want to take this box and we're going to put it inside of the first one. So I'm just going to cut that, move this div down here, and then put this other one inside of it. And the reason for this is you are definitely going to have times where you are going to want to create kind of complex arrangements of content, and that very well could mean that you're going to end up putting divs or other items inside of other divs. Now, something that you could do to kind of make this a little easier is maybe you want to have one of these be a div, and maybe you want one of them to be a section, or maybe you want one of them to be an aside. It kind of depends on what the point of the content is, but you can definitely nest things together. And right now this doesn't really look like a lot, but there's a lot of things you could do with this. Like you could use this to create a profile. You could have maybe the inside div is actually a picture, and you could have the picture, and you could have a little profile section where you have text that's telling you about a person, and then you have their image, and you have a whole gallery of these where you have all of the people who are working at this particular place, and every single one of them has their own little div, and it gives them a little synopsis of each person, like what their title is, a little bit of text about them. So you could do this very easily by creating these div boxes and then just specifying like what is the actual size of them going to be. Now this is a fixed size, so this isn't necessarily going to be the most responsive. So down the line you would want to change it to be a percentage, so then it's going to only take up so much of the space of the screen. All right, so Something that I want to do next with this is I want to show you how we can work with a property that's called float. I'm going to add this to both of them. So I'm going to have float left on the first one and float right on the second one. It kind of works a little bit like kind of text alignment where you can move something to the left or the right, but it behaves in a different manner because it basically kind of breaks the content out of the flow of everything else, and it makes it so that other things essentially kind of word wrap around that content. And so it's no longer having to kind of stick to the content. This is something that gets used a lot with pictures, so that's why I wanted to bring up the example of working with a kind of profile, because you could have the picture where you could have a picture in that div 2 spot where it's a little box, and you could float that to the right, and then you could essentially have all of the text that would be in there it would wrap around that box. And that's something that we could actually do next. We could grab some lorem ipsum. And instead of it having box 1, in box 2, we could change that. Now it's not quite doing what I'd like it to do, and that's just because we have those fixed dimensions. That's one of the reasons why it can be so difficult working with fixed layouts. And a lot of it, like if you see issues where you have content that is kind of spilling out of a container and is not behaving the way that you think it should, more often than not, it's because you have either the content inside of it is a fixed size or the container that it's in is a fixed size, and it's not working together responsibly. But you can kind of see, maybe if I were to shorten this text, that this second box is kind of wrapping around this text. It's just there's a lot more text than there is the item. But you could use that to essentially do kind of like a word wrap sort of idea. So I'm going to put this back to where it was. And what I want to do with it too is I want to remove this again, put it back. Save that. And now we can actually kind of see what's going on. So we've got the first box is floating to the left, second box is floating to the right, and that gives us a lot of options where if we wanted to now, we could have multiple columns. You could have 2 columns where you could have one that floats to the left, one that floats to the right. You could actually have 3 columns. I'm gonna take div 1, and you don't necessarily have to do this because a lot of this is just kind of helping to illustrate this. Now I duplicated this first one 3 times, so it's going to have all the same properties of the first box. Save that, refresh. And so you don't necessarily have to use both the float left and the float right. You could use just one of them and you could still use that to create multiple columns. And what this does is it's saying that, you know, if there is space, it's going to fill in, and then if there's not, it's going to just go on to the next column. So it's a really good way of being able to have multiple things, and then if they don't fit, they move down. You can see too that there's this point where it's recognizing that we do want to have both of these items, and then if it can't fit in, it just that one is moving down as well. So you could kind of use that to kind of control the order and how things are going to arrange themselves. So this example here, this is going to be really handy when you are working with your homework with the 4 sections, because they're essentially going to all have the same style. where you're going to float to the left, you're going to have, in that case, you're going to have a percentage instead, and then you're going to have a little bit of padding. One of the issues of working with floats is that the content that is floating isn't really held back anymore by other content around it, so it kind of breaks out of the structure of everything, which then can cause other things to kind of move up into places that you don't want. And to help give you an example of this, I'm going to go ahead and remove these extra divs, but I'm going to add a footer, and I'll just do kind of like basic copyright. And in order to see this a little better, I'm going to add in a border. Let's just do a black border. So I'm going to save that, refresh, and you'll notice that this footer has basically slid behind all of our floated content. And we can kind of see it a little better by this second one because it does have that margin that's kind of helping it push away from the corner. And so if we want to make sure that we don't have this issue where we have all of this other content that is now kind of sliding behind the floated things, we have to be very careful. And we want to use a property that is called clear. So with clear, you can either clear left, right, or both. And what it's essentially saying is this content is going to clear things that are floated to the left. So now anything that would be to the left, it's going to kind of break out of that. So what you would often do is like bringing this back to the homework and the wireframe of it is what you would probably do is you would have these sections floated, and then you could say, well, for the main, or you could say for the footer, you could set clear to that, and so it's going to make sure that anything after it is cleared. Now when it comes to your final, and in your final you're going to be required to have multiple columns and kind of more of a complex layout, what you might do, because a lot of websites are built into these horizontal sections that kind of go across, and you would look at a horizontal section and then all of the vertical columns inside of it. And so what you might say is for every horizontal grouping of content on the site, I want those to have a setting where it's going to clear everything. And then you could have everything kind of floating the way that you want. It really is just going to depend on what you're trying to construct and what you're trying to do with it. So this would work fine. Like right now, this left container is taller, and so it's not necessarily an issue that we aren't floating to the right, but let's see what we do, or what happens when we do the reverse. So now if it's only clearing things to the right, we're still having issues with it not filling in. And again, there could be a reason for why you would want to do this. It's not to say that there's never going to be a reason why you would want that. So maybe you do have more, like let's say that you have a left navigation and you want that left navigation to float to the left, and you kind of want everything else on the page to just kind of fill in on the right side for some reason. You could use this as a way to kind of control that and just make sure that if needed, it just clears each other. And then we also have float, or sorry, I was looking at the wrong one. We've got clear both. So now it's going to clear both of them. Now we can add in more content and it shouldn't be a problem. All right, so just to kind of recap, because I feel like this can kind of be a little bit confusing and hard to visualize. So floats let you take content kind of outside of the normal flow, and it lets them kind of move to the left or the right, kind of a little bit like alignment. And it also other content to sort of wrap around it, which we were able to see a little bit easier with this footer because it was able to kind of slide behind. So not only does the content kind of wrap around, it also sort of moves behind the flow of everything too, which we'll kind of see a little bit later as well. And then clear lets content break outside of that kind of flow where things are. It's making those items that had been floating kind of rigid structures again, where anything after it will go in and it'll actually stay in place. And then this next one, this property is called the overflow property. And the overflow property is used to configure how content should be displayed if it's too large for the area that is allocated. And that was one of the things that we saw when I copied in that lorem ipsum, is all of that text was just kind of spilling outside of the container and it wasn't actually filling into that space. And the overflow property is really great for two things. The first one is just what I was describing, where you have too much text or too much content and it can't fill in that space. But it's also a really great way of being able to deal with these containers that are inside of other ones that are working as floats. Because if you have a float where the size as the window is being resized, if that content can't really fit into the container anymore, overflow helps control the content. So back with like your homework assignment, a lot of times when you would have something like this where you've got these sections and they're all floating, what you can do is you can apply the clear to the footer, but then for the main that would be holding these, you can apply overflow and you can control what would happen to those sections so that way they don't accidentally kind of just pop out of the structure that they're in if there isn't room for everything. So let's actually, I'm going to deviate from this a little bit. We'll create a main, and this I think will kind of help make this a little bit more similar to your homework. So we could have this main, and then let me put the main above here. So overflow, we've got a couple of different properties. Let me see if it will actually bring up. So your textbook lists visible, hidden, auto, and scroll. And scroll is the default as well. And you'll notice that there's a couple other ones in here, but our main ones are going to be these ones. So I'm going to start the first one. And chances are, like, we're not actually going to really see it here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that lorem ipsum again, and I'm going to put it in one of these containers. And we'll add in an overflow there as well. So let's do I'm going to actually add this to both of them. Okay, so we've got both of these boxes now have the text running out of them. And then I'm going to add in overflow visible. And we can just kind of save and refresh that. So visible means the text is going to be visible and it's just going to continue to go. It's going to continue to kind of spill out of the container. Now there is also hidden. This might be good for like an image or something where you don't mind it being cropped, or maybe you have like a blurb maybe you have some articles and you're just giving a bit of a text description preview of what they could look at, and then you would know that you can click on it to see more. So maybe it doesn't really matter if it cuts off the content, but here you'll see that it is going to actually cut off the text. And then the default option is scroll. And that's going to add in a scroll bar so that way you still have access to all of the content. And this may or may not be something that you might use. I feel like this used to be used a lot more frequently on websites back when websites were fixed, where you would want to have kind of all of the general template of the website all on one screen space, and you would just have the text kind of scrolling. I remember seeing this a lot with blogs, where the blog would have a fixed template and all of the text would just scroll and everything else would kind of stay the same. So it's something that you could use if you really wanted to have the surrounding content fill in a very specific space. You just want to be mindful that this might not necessarily be the best experience if someone was on a mobile device having to scroll through this content, and it could make it a little bit less accessible. But that is one option that you could use. Now, for example, like your homework is going to ask that you add in an overflow that is just set to auto, which the default is to scroll. And it's one of those cases where the way that it's written, it's more than likely not actually going to be an issue at all. That's just going to be sort of a backup for if it weren't to display quite right, essentially. All right, so I'm going to take this example and I'm going to modify it a little bit to try to help with how you could use this in the future for potentially your final project. With your final project, you are going to have a 2-column layout where you're going to have at least some of your content in 2 columns. Basically, usually what people do is they take the content that's in the main and they make whatever's in the main be two different columns, and essentially when it's desktop it's 2 columns, and then when it's mobile it's a single column, and those columns stack over top of each other. So I'm going to change this so we don't have the height. Change this so it's 20, let's do 25%. And I'm going to remove this. I'm going to remove the second div, and I'm going to just repeat this 3 times. Actually, let's do this twice. I'm going to change this to 45%. So this is how you could essentially put your content into multiple columns, and you can see that by having them be a percentage, they're just going to flex and kind of take up more space. And so you would kind of have 2 ways of working with this. You could have the items be flexible and they're just going to continue to flex and be responsive for this space. And then ultimately what you would do is once you start working with sets of styles, you could say, okay, for this one set, for desktop, I'm going to have these things float, and they're going to be in percentages where it's going to be responsive and they can kind of fill in next to each other and it'll be great. And then you could say when it's desktop though, it's no longer going to have a float, and everything is just going to stack on top of each other instead. So you would kind of have 2 sets of styles where you would remove the floats for the mobile version, and that could work. Or what you could also do is you could change these back to a fixed dimension. So let's do just like 450 pixels. And you could figure out whatever sort of size you would want these to stay, and basically it would behave kind of responsively, where it would figure out, okay, well, if there's no longer room for this, it's going to just stack on underneath of it. So there's a couple ways that you could work with this responsively, and if you work with it fixed like this, what you could do is you could go in and you could create a section and I'm going to duplicate, whoops. So I've got the two divs inside of a section. I'm going to copy this, paste it so we have two of them. And so now what you could do is you could have like these horizontal sets where, and actually they're allowing themselves to kind of all fill in. So you could have as many kind of columns as you want. These first two are going to work with each other. Now, if I don't want these bottom ones to kind of fill in next to them, if I don't like that, what I could do is for this section, I could add in a style, and I could say, for the section, I want it to clear, both. And so now they're always these sections will stack over top of each other. And let me just add a little bit of margin. So we can kind of have a little bit more grouping. And I know this doesn't look like a whole lot right at this moment, but this is going to give you a lot of different flexibility in how you can build out your website. I've had students before where what they did is for their two columns in their final project, they basically would kind of alternate what would be inside of these containers. They would have maybe a text description, and then they would have a picture to go with it, and that would explain one topic. And then on the next line, they would have a picture on one side, and then they'd have more text, and so they'd have these pairs. And what would happen is, as it would resize and go more to a mobile size, it would alternate where it would have that text picture, and it would be able to pair those sets of information with each other. And part of what helps with that pairing is having these sections, so that way you make sure that you have whatever is in this first one and the second one, they'll end up close to each other, and then the third one and the fourth one will end up close to each other. And we'll look at that more in the future when I start talking about the final project, but I just wanted you to have kind of an idea of how you could work with these containers. All right, so there's one last thing that I wanted to mention in working with this, and that is working with box sizing. And for this, I want to look at your textbook. So the CSS box sizing property is excellent because it really helps when you're trying to think about your columns and how much space everything should take up. As you might have noticed in working with this example, it can be kind of difficult to figure out what size everything should be, because the browser defaults or your own measurements start kicking in, where you have the padding and the margin. And so if I said, I want this, let me switch this, because I actually kind of already took this into consideration. So let's say that we have 50% for these. And you'll notice that with 50%, they don't fill in next to each other, they return to the next line. And that's because there's not enough space with the padding and margins for them to actually fit. So I could try 45%. And 45% finally does fit in. So you do have to kind of take into consideration how much space there is And something that can be really beneficial with that, though, is using box sizing. So box sizing property causes the browser calculation of the width or height to include the content's actual width or height in addition to the width or height of any padding and border that may exist. So there is the option of having it be set to content box, the default, and border box. And so here's a really good example from the book where there's this default where each one of these is defaulting where it's including, it's only including the content. And then on the next page, it's switched to only be including, it's kind of making them all smaller. So it's including the size of the padding as part of the overall size. So if you're saying, I want each of these boxes to be 30%. Now the padding and the border are also included in that 30% versus in the previous one, only the content was part of that 30%. And is keeping it so everything couldn't fit inside of it. And so my recommendation kind of from here on out is that it's probably going to be easier to use the box sizing set to border box. So that way it does include the padding and the border in the sides. And so you don't have to think about those measurements separately. And there's something in this reading that gets really, it's really not talked about. It kind of is overshadowed. They really don't highlight it. And that's this universal selector. And it's just this little asterisk. And what it means is just all HTML elements are going to have this style. And this is something that you would want to put at the very top of your CSS before body, before the wrapper, before anything else. And it looks exactly like this. You just put this asterisk and then you say, I want, and then whatever it would be. In this case, it's saying, I want the box sizing to be set to border box. So that's going to mean absolutely every single HTML element that's going to be on the page, all of them are going to be set where the size that you say that you want these items to be is going to be set where it's taking in consideration the padding and the border into that size. So if you have something like this div that has padding in a border, it's now going to include that in that setting. So what that would look like is at the top here, I would put in this asterisk, and for some reason it's not going to show the same color, but it's still going to work fine. And we're going to say box sizing. We're going to say border box, hit save. And it's just going to adjust it a little bit. So now I should be able to go in and I should be able to add this to 50% unless the margin keeps it. It looks like the margin might still be an issue. Let's change the margin so it's a little smaller, but the padding, the border at least are not. So it's cutting down on all these variables. All right, so with removing the margin at least, so the margin's still an issue, we've got this all fitting now. And if you wanted to see what that would look like differently, you could just switch this to content. Whoops. And now it's just a little larger because we've got this 5 pixels of padding and then the 3 pixels from the border. And you just want to be clear that, you know, when you are, whether you're the one who's designing things and you're sending your design to the person who's coding, or if it's the reverse where you're getting in a design from someone and maybe they've kind of mapped everything out in Photoshop or Illustrator, you just want to be really clear when they tell you the dimensions, how you're going to be actually measuring things out. Are you going to be measuring them out in percentages? Does that percentage include the padding? And just be aware of how everything is being measured so that way you're on the same page when you're communicating your designs. All right, so I've got a few more videos that I'm going to create that are going to tie into the content for chapter 7. The next thing I want to talk about is working with printing, because a lot of what we are looking at is looking at how we're going to organize things and kind of prepare the layout for eventually when we start looking at creating our designs, so that way we can have desktop, tablet, and mobile. But I also want us to take a look at how to design things for printing them as well. So I'm going to have a video that's going to talk about working with printing styles. And then I'm going to have another video that's going to be looking at how you can work with your navigation as a fixed navigation, and then also work with linking to specific parts in your website. And that's going to be kind of the key things from chapter 7 that we're going to look at. And then the next set of videos is going to all tie in with chapter 8's content. So if you've got any questions on working with kind of basic layouts, you can add your comment in the discussion, or you can send me an email. And just a kind of reminder, when you do start working on the final, you may want to come back to this video and kind of look at this demonstration, just because it helps to kind of show, or at least you might find this a little bit useful when you're working on your homework for this week. Now, I do think that for your final, there's going to be an easier way to do this. That's going to involve using Flexbox, but this still technically would be perfectly fine to use for your final, where you're just having to do the 2 columns. All right, so best of luck, and let me know if you've got any questions.